So when we look at fashion movement, we're really looking at how fashions change, how consumers become aware of what's new, what's happening in the industry, and how something from the runway becomes popular, or from wherever, really. So how does the fashion style go from the runway to the mass retailers? So obviously we think about this, we think about the runway, we think about knockoffs, etc. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, actually. All fashion starts and all fashion ends. That's part of the industry. It has to go away in order for something new to come in its place. Just like your cell phones, after a certain period of time, your phone's going to start slowing down. Purposeful that the industry does that so that you go buy a new cell phone or a new TV or a new whatever. Okay? So when we look at the cycle, we're looking at the period in which it's introduced to consumers, period in which a large percentage of the consumers buy it, and then when it's discarded. So we measure the life cycle over sales, how many of those items sold, or we can actually also measure it within a trend. If we're saying we're evaluating a retro 60s trend that's going on, we can categorize certain products in that retro 60s trend and then analyze how many of them sell over a period of time. Time can either be a season, like the fall season, spring season. We can measure it over a month, we can measure it over a year, we can measure it over a week, doesn't matter. But it gives us that indication of how far along this cycle we are, whether or not consumers are still purchasing it, whether or not the demand for that product has slowed down, etc. And we usually look at what sales are recorded by the businesses in the industry. So a product cycle is really just a graph. A graph is a visual representation of numbers. So it's the visual representation of the sales that we're looking at. And we're going to chart this graph over time. And so what we're really looking at is the progress of a trend or the diffusion or spread of that trend. In some textbooks and research papers, you'll see that there are 3 distinct stages, but there's actually 5. We look at an introduction stage, we look at the rise stage, we look at the peak or mass acceptance, the decline, and then the end or obsolescence. Now, why do I say that? The innovation stage is the creation. So we're really not looking at sales yet. So when we talk about innovation of an idea, it first has to be available to the consumer in order for us to measure the cycle of that product. Okay, so in the introduction stage, fashion innovators, super creative people who are really into what the newest, latest thing is, are purchasing it from super high-end retailers at very high prices. In the rise stage, we now have leaders and trendsetters. We're still in high price points and better departments or specialty boutiques. And so we're really still looking at an upper echelon of society that's purchasing. As we look at this culmination or peak phase, as it's still rising, followers are purchasing from department stores and other stores in moderate price points. But as it begins to decline, we're really looking at mass chain, we're looking at budget prices, we're marked down from our traditional retailers here. The trend is starting to fade, and we can see that. And so this is when you're getting a deal on it. And then in the decline stage, we're in serious markdowns, discount racks, so we're in clearest price points here. And then in the obsolescence stage, nobody's buying it. It's just, no, you can't even give it away. So this is the general idea of this. So I'm going to put this into play for you. I'm going to take this Alexander McQueen peep toe ankle boot at $1,155. So, very few of us spend $1,100 on a pair of shoes, especially anything that has any variation to it as opposed to something that's just classic. So obviously, there's a small percentage of clients who are buying this, and they're buying it from the McQueen store. Probably not available in a department store, and so this is really exclusive. But over a period of time, it's going to get knocked off and knocked off and knocked off. So here's Steve Madden at $129. This is super affordable. So you can see the sales are going to rapidly increase at this point. Then we go to an Aldo, a little less expensive, more consumers can afford it, and a Milano at $70.99. The sales are going to drop off because the price points are lower. Even though there are more consumers buying it, it still is at a lower price point. And then we get to a $35 price point and eventually to a wet seal price point. And $20 after that, it's over. Nobody's buying it. So this is a pretty easy way to understand the typical life cycle of an item that is considered to be fashion or that popular thing. Okay. When we look at the marketing of this, and I'm going to go over this a whole lot more in the next week as opposed to this week. And I didn't really even include this part in the page, but I'll go over this anyway with you. So in the intro, this is really exclusive advertising and marketing. So this is in the pages of our high fashion glossy that might cost you $10 to buy the magazine now, probably featured on their website. Definitely in trade papers, which means papers that are read by people who are in the business. It might be a designer advertising this to retail stores to buy at market next week, or that kind of thing. As we look at the rise stage, it's advertised in retail ads as something new. And so here we're going to see it in store windows. This is going to be something the stores are going to start pushing via their social media and outdoor advertising. As we get to the acceleration stage, still in retail ads, but now we're looking at promotional price points. So like take 20% off on Labor Day kind of thing. And then we're going to start seeing markdowns here as well. Okay. By the time we get into this last phase, we're at least at 50% markdown. As we get into the decline, there's no advertising, no reason to, and obsolescence, nothing's happening. All right, so what influences this spread and what influences how fast something's going to go through this cycle or how slow it's going to go? And then what influences styles you see on the runway that never make it to market? Factors that influence the movement, how consumers adopt, how it spreads, who the influencers are, and who the followers are. Adoption means purchasing. Well, it means using. If I take it on as my own, I'm using it, but it really is, we measure this over sales. We look at diffusion, how many products are being knocked off, how is it mass disseminated among consumers. The more power the influencer has, the more likely it's going to be diffused into society. And most consumers that buy at retail, we would call followers. I know that's a tough one to swallow, but we're all followers there. Okay. So let's look at what speeds up this cycle. Factors that make fashion change faster. These are what we call accelerating factors. They're going to speed up a trend. They're either going to speed it up and make it more successful, or they're going to kill it, which that happens too. And these are things that affect consumer buying decisions. Widespread buying power, increased leisure time, more education, improved status of women, technological advances, promotion and marketing, seasonal changes. Let's look at each one of these. So increased buying power. This means your discretionary income is improving. Discretionary is your play money. So you come home with your paycheck, you pay your bills, you buy your food, your necessities, and this is the money you have left to spend on the stuff you don't need. Fashion is that. I know some people would say fashion is a necessity, but it's not. It's a luxury. Clothing might be a necessity, but we don't measure basics in this trend idea. We really measure what's happening in fashion change. So when consumers spend, manufacturers are going to make more goods. There's going to be more variety out there and more choice. And that's an important aspect to understand. Consumers are the drivers of everything, absolutely everything. Don't for 1 minute think the retailer controls this. The retailer will only sell what a consumer's going to buy. Manufacturer's only going to make what they know they can sell. Although we do see a lot of junk on the clearance racks. Okay, leisure time. So what this basically means is if you're doing better financially, you can travel more, you can not work as long hours, you work your way up the ladder of a job, you have a lot more time to spend doing other things, okay? So free time demands clothing for other activities. Active wear to go work out or do yoga or Pilates. You're going on vacation, you might need some swimwear or loungewear. You need some evening wear because you're going to Vegas, whatever. Education. So this speaks to sort of a traditional mindset that if you have a higher education, you're going to be more successful in your career. Now, I know we're not seeing that translate directly, but what we do find is higher educated people tend to question products more, tend to do their homework, do some price comparison, maybe read some consumer reports, that kind of thing. So while this aspect to it may be fading, it still is a prevalent influencer. All right, women's status. Now, I will say some of this is artificial in terms of social barriers because we really don't have laws that restrict women. And I'm not going to take this politically, but I'm just going to say that. So when we say, oh, women are held back in the job, they don't make as much money, that's starting to change rapidly and drastically. So we really can't look at that too much. But what this was based on was before the 1920s, when women didn't have a voice, really it was the husband who made the decisions. And women had very little choices of jobs or opportunities outside of the home. Today, we do still see this in some countries, I'll say. But in terms of our first world consumer markets, I think this factor is gone. But what I will say is the more women, and I'll say men too, but the more consumers fall into the prey, if you will, of an expectation of what you look like or need to look like, you're going to spend more money on that junk that you think society wants you to spend in order to be accepted. So it could be cosmetic surgeries, it could be Botox, it could be a fashion brand, it could be whatever. So we do see this in some ways, but I would say this then could be marketed across all genders. Today, women have more discretionary income, and they're definitely influencing the speed of fashion cycles. All right, technology, this is pretty easy to understand. Faster I can make something and get it to you and tell you, this is available for you, the faster you're going to want it, right? We see fashion all over the world instantly because of the internet. So it has shrunk that time in that introduction phase. Products are knocked off so rapidly that consumers are able to purchase it by the time it gets to the high-end retail stores. We also see technology advancing in new fibers for manufacturing, new ideas of aesthetics, what's beautiful. Cosmetic industry needs to sell you stuff you don't need, so they're just going to create a new ideal of beauty that, is using this product that you just got to go buy, right? It advances the production of goods the faster we can make it. It advances the distribution of goods. Look at Amazon Prime. Everybody wants next day delivery, right? So the faster consumers get stuff, the faster they want the next new stuff. Promotion and marketing. And we're going to talk a lot about that as we go through next week and subsequent weeks. When we look at marketing, there's a whole lot of new ways in which brands are getting information out there and ways in which trends are marketed to consumer. But either way, visibility is the number one key. We have to see it. A lot of retailers use sort of flat images of products. They don't sell as well as if they're on a real model and you actually see the sizing. So the more visual and the more visually involved the consumer is, the more they're going to buy it, and faster. Okay, so here's that McQueen booty on our celebrities, the Who Wore It Better pages. So, wow, that's in Glamour magazine or in Allure or in 17. Now it's in consumer magazines you get off the rack in the grocery store. Not the fast knockoff of this is going to ensure the longevity of that trend. Seasonal changes. New fresh goods have to come out in order for consumers to stay interested in a brand or interested in anything. Consumers look forward to new seasonal goods, stimulates changes, and stimulates sales. So most European designers have 2 shows a year, spring, summer, and then fall, winter shows. In the US, we actually have 5 different markets. So you could go to the spring market, the summer market, the fall 1 market, fall to winter market. Sometimes resort is a separate market. Sometimes it's mixed in with spring. Resort is like a weird little hiccup season between winter and spring. So it's like you live in a cold atmosphere and you want to go to the Bahamas for your Christmas break. You need swimwear quickly. That's why we see swimwear in the stores in the end of December. And it's sort of an old traditional set of selling seasons, but it actually still sells this way today. Naturally occurring seasons change with the weather, of course. So, it started to get cold. We want sweaters, we want jackets. But we also need within those seasonal selling seasons for there to be change of new goods at a regular pace. All right, now let's look at what slows this thing down. Might also just stop it altogether. It's going to affect a consumer whether they buy it or not. Habit and custom, religion, sumptuary laws, reduction in consumers' buying power, wars, natural disasters, and just the general nature of the merchandise. So consumers' habits and customs. If you're used to buying online during COVID, you might just keep buying online. This now has been your customary way of shopping. If you are a thrift shopper, you're going to keep shopping thrift. You may never go to a regular store. So your habits of purchasing are going to be consistent. You may also be brand loyal to one brand and no other, and year after year, you're not going to deviate from it. You might have a color that you pretty much just wear that color and you don't deviate from it. So that's going to be tougher for new brands to get to this consumer because this consumer has a very habitual way of buying. Customs can also influence fashion. The traditional white wedding dress. I don't care who you are, but if you open any Facebook page and there's a wedding, she's probably in white. And it's traditional period. She's 8 months pregnant. She's got a white wedding dress on. So it is still considered customary. We do see it changing, but not as rapidly as we see it remaining the same. You graduate from college, you want to wear your graduation cap and gown as a symbol of that, right? Okay, religious beliefs, traditions, and customs. If we say fashion is a reflection of society, it is a reflection of the mood of a culture. It is a reflection of the times. Heavy religious groups will maintain a very traditional sense of dress, and that may never change. The idea of falling in line, fitting in, those are all very important to traditional groups maintaining a cohesive environment. So fashion, as change, is discouraged. Strict religious beliefs in a country, city, religion may stop change in fashion for men and women within that group. All right, sumptuary laws comes from the word consumption, what you can and cannot use. So these are laws that tell the public or dictate to the public what they can and cannot use. And I guess I don't have a picture. Sorry about that. Throughout history, we see this in many different periods of time. During World War II, we had fabric restrictions. Women couldn't wear pantyhose. It was a whole thing. So this is going to stop that change. All right, decreased buying power. A recession or a slow economy. When your money is tight, you're not spending on stuff you don't need. You're trying to pay your electricity bills, your food bills, your gas bills. So a recession can drastically affect fashion change. So dropping that play money, right, is going to reduce how much stuff you spend on. Wars, natural disasters can stop a trend or slow it down altogether. So during 9/11, for instance, in New York, it happened on the morning of the middle of Fashion Week. And the shows were being held at Bryant Park, which is in Midtown, and the World Trade Centers were downtown. And that just shut Fashion Week down. People couldn't get out of New York. They couldn't get flights out. I mean, it was just miserable. But all the trends that were going to be shown on the runway never were created. They were never made into garments and sold to retailers. So what was before 9/11 just continued in retail stores with reorders for almost 2 years. These can change consumer production. They can change manufacturing. Retailers are going to buy more safely. They may even close due to the conditions of what's happening. Think of COVID, how many businesses shut down. So that drop in that play money really does affect your spending. The nature of the merchandise, some things just move faster than others. Consumer segments, we look at women's wear moves faster. Junior wear is, or young women's wear moves parallel, but men's and children's wear move through this cycle more slowly, even though today we see more fashion interest. If you go to any department store, the men's and children's departments are going to be smaller because women buy more junk they don't need. All right, the nature of the merchandise. If it's just weird, you see it coming down the runway, it's just weird, most retailers are not going to buy it. Or if you see it hanging on a hanger but you can't figure out how to put it on, retailers won't be able to sell it, so they're going to mark it down fast. So again, if it's too weird, it's not going to have mass acceptance. All right, so we have 3 cycles represented here. Middle is a traditional fashion bell curve, which we just talked about. A fad is going to be a hiccup, short cycle, and a very limited number of consumers who are going to buy it. A classic fits the lifestyle of more consumers. It's going to stick around for a while. And so that cycle may just never end. If we look at the fad, classic, and traditional fashion cycle, you can see how if we're looking at like coats, a classic coat might remain in but not sell as much because the weather changes, but then that same style is going to come back the next year. So classics kind of just don't ever end. All right, let's look at a consumer buying cycle versus a consumer use cycle. So the red is the cycle we just went through. But the blue cycle, you can see it starts after and it continues. So you might see a coat and you're like, oh, this is so cute, but the weather is still 85 degrees and you haven't worn it yet. 2 months later, you're going to start wearing it. The following winter might be gone from the stores, but you're still wearing it. So we tend to continue to use fashion products even after they're no longer available. All right, let's look at retros versus vintage. Vintage is something from the past. It actually was designed, manufactured, and sold in the 1960s, and you found it in a thrift store. Retro is something inspired by the past, but it's updated in a more modern, contemporary way to fit the period in which that it's being sold. So if we say we're retroing the 60s, you're not wearing the polyester junk from the 60s and 70s. You're wearing an updated version of that trend. So here we can see a basic shift dress, twigging in the 1960s, and I think this was from the early 2000s. Okay, retro recurring styles basically is what we're talking about. They're really adapted to suit the times in which they reappear. So we're not looking at the past as we want that actual same garment. So why do they happen? Well, in most cases, it's because there is some very strong parallel in the mood of the times. So if fashion is a reflection of the mood of the times, it means something's happening that is echoing a past decade, past period of time, and forecasters have jumped on that and started to tell designers, we're starting to feel that vibe again from the 1970s or whatever decade, and so designers are going to start paying attention to that. So I do use this example because this is easy to understand, but I don't know how many of you were born in the 90s. But in the 1990s, we had a very, very strong retro 60s trend. And it really started when Bill Clinton threw his hat in the ring for president. He was younger and, thought he was cool, I guess. And he smoked pot and blew a saxophone. Anyway, the forecasters started making parallels to him and JFK in the 1960s. They began to see civil rights unrest in the 90s again, and strong black leaders emerged like Jesse Jackson. Though he's no Martin Luther King Jr., he did have a strong following, and he did command a million-man march in the 1990s. We saw pop being the drug of choice. We saw retro 60s music. Think of Lenny Kravitz and Alanis Morissette kind of echoing Janis Joplin and, music from the 60s. Anyway, this echoed through art, this echoed through fashion. We started to see things like beanbag chairs and lava lamps and beaded curtains, and the Volkswagen Bug and Beetle came back, and the Mini Cooper came back in automobiles. And then we started to see a retro 60s in fashion. So when we look at retros, we always pay attention to what decade is being retroed and why, because it reflects the zeitgeist, the mood of the times. So here we can see some interesting stuff happening. Modern down there on the lower right is a takeoff on Yves Saint Laurent's Mondrian dress, which was the 1960s dress. Upper right is Marc Jacobs' 1960s retro campaign. When Mad Men was really popular on TV, we started to see a lot of 50s influence in fashion. So here's Mad Men on the right. You can see the costume designer really used 50s styling and early 60s styling, I'll say. When Great Gatsby came out, we started to see tons of Art Deco influence and fashion really responding to that. Pop culture is a big influence. We look at music festivals or art installations. Those are huge. Beyonce is classic for always retroing something, bringing back something, even her choreography. Here you can see that Mondrian dress again. Upper left is the original one from Yves Saint Laurent. You can see it here, Nicki Minaj wearing it, and other companies like Forever 21 knocking it off. So here we can see the cycle of a recurring fashion or a retro. So you have the original cycle that would have happened in the 60s, and then you have nothing for 30 years, and then you see it come back in the 90s. Some things just should never, ever, ever come back, right?